Francine, have you seen this amazing graphic on the Bloomberg terminal? So about Goldman Sachs, government Sachs, since the end of 2005, there have only been a matter of days in which a Goldman alumnus didn't hold the position of either Prime Minister, Finance Minister or Central Bank Chief in a G7 country.
I mean, this is classic Simon Kennedy, who's in charge of our economics coverage.
And Simon himself is on the phone. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Simon.
Well, how did you get this idea? Did you just know that every post around the planet of import is some point got a Goldman bloke in it?
So I think this is quite Bloombergy, but I did know that Mario Draghi, who stepped down at the weekend as Italian Premier, had some time in Goldman. And that got me thinking, with the arrival of Rishi Sunak, just how little there had been in recent years, a moment where the G7 lacked a Goldman Sachs alumnus at its table. And when we put the data together with the team at Bloomberg Graphics, we discovered it was really only a matter of about 48 hours.
So why do you think it's not, why is it always Goldman Sachs and not other banks? Like, why not JP?
I just think it's tradition. I think there is you can criticise it and say that if you look back at Goldman, a long period of time, Treasury Secretaries, I think of Secretary of State as well, there've been that driving force. And Goldman's been around a long time. JP Morgan's had different forms. There's been a moment, I think, in time when Jamie Dimon has been linked with the Treasury, so perhaps that's that moment. I don't know quite what's in the Goldman Sachs water, but clearly people feel that there's for good or bad, there is definitely a road between the Goldman headquarters and Washington and now other capitals.
Thank you, Simon. I'm Francine Lacqua in the London studio.
I'm David Merritt, back with you again, Fran, in the London studio.
And this is In the City, Bloomberg's podcast, connecting you to the stories and the voices at the heart of the City of London. This week,
this government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. Trust is earned, and I will earn yours.
So there he is now. Is this the Prime Minister that the city really needs? There's a sense that maybe the city's got their man in number 10 Downing Street.
The 42-year-old, Dave, spent the bulk of his private sector days working for hedge funds after a stint at Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, and I think he's probably he is the first UK Prime Minister who has worked at a hedge fund as an activist investor, no less, looking at underpriced assets and trying to boost their value. Can he do the same with Britain?
Yeah, so he understands it, but I don't know whether he wants to throw his weight behind it. We'll discuss whether he's got just the right CV to win over a market that has lost faith in the government.
Joining us, back again, a show favourite, Bloomberg editor on our finance team, Katherine Griffiths, and the man who bills himself as all things City of London. Back again also, Bloomberg's editor, Tom Metcalf.
Thank you both for joining us. Katherine, all right, so we have a former hedge fund manager in charge. We have former Goldman Sachs, former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. Is this good or bad for the city?
So I think Rishi Sunak's very lucky because he comes in, as he himself has said, to clear up this sort of massive mess that his predecessor has made. So he's already in massive positive territory with the city. But I think that people are divided. There's lots of people in the city who will very much appreciate his moderate, cautious notes, but there are certainly those who are sort of crying this morning because their dream for reform, for City of London 2.0, maybe that dream is dead.
I know when we talked in the summer, Katherine, we explored, didn't we, how the city really was pivoting from, being a bit sceptical about Liz Truss's agenda, this big radical approach, to thinking, you know what, maybe it's just what we need to get this economy going. And there's massive disappointment, obviously, at how that crashed and burned. And, there isn't going to be a radical reform now, is there? It's going to be, let's try and stabilise the ship.
Yes. And actually, even now, with people being very grateful and keen to see him stabilising the ship, even now, people are saying, well, actually, we do need to hear a bit about growth and we need to hear a positive message. I think probably what we will get is a positive message, but it will be more one that Sunak actually already articulated last year, which was about fintech, it was about green investment, and it may be far less about the possibility of yet more benefits for non-doms and whether or not we're going to get rid of inheritance tax that I think there were some people hoping might be the case under a Truss city vision.
So, Tom, when he was Chancellor, under Boris Johnson, there was just not much love to the city. They didn't do anything to upset them. They just didn't really focus on it. Then we have Kwasi Kwarteng with the Big Bang 2.0. Like, how are city grandees feeling about it? Do they want less regulation? Do they need less regulation? Or are they just happy that things are stable for the moment?
I think it's been such a bizarre few weeks, so much chaos that I think it's probably fair to say that stability is now top of people's mind. It may well be true that, under Sunak, they're going to see higher taxes than were promised by, Truss and Kwarteng. But I think they'll probably take that as sort of the necessary evil of moving away from what was a pretty critical time. So I think stability and perhaps just, sort of a very slick presentation is probably what we can expect. But yes, it'll be quite amusing because obviously during the moments of chaos, they were hoping for stability. And I'm sure now they have stability, or they'll probably now go back, as Katherine was saying, to but can we please get a little bit more reforms or stuff like that?
Never happy, are they?
Exactly, no.
So, I mean, we track obviously the market moves really closely here at Bloomberg. And, the gilt market was the thing, wasn't it, the last few months? That's what really arguably did for her agenda. And actually, we're seeing now the long-term gilt yields back to where they were before. And we've spoken, I think, Katherine, you and I were talking about the possibility of long-term scarring to the markets. It looks like maybe things are healing a bit faster. So is that credibility in the markets now fully back to where it should be?
I think, actually, there's a possibility that the fiscal event might even be slightly more positive than people were positioning for in the last few days.
In terms of growth forecasts, just a little bit less doom and gloom than we were
a little bit less doom and gloom, exactly. I think there could be a chance that Hunt and Sunak are able to kind of dial back the sort of doom and dire warnings, and whether that turns into cold hard numbers and policies, maybe not, but certainly in terms of messaging, I think there's a view out there that it could be not quite as bad as they had feared.
And actually, we had the Barclays CEO come out and say, in terms of the gilts, the LDI market, he's seeing it, as you say, return to sort of September the 23rd.
Right. So pensions are okay. They're not going to be a huge run on assets. I mean, some of those really apocalyptic warnings we had are actually not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's like a big step change from, literally a week ago, where there were still those fears. It just does feel it's kind of gone back to a bit more like normal. That's not to say it couldn't swing back. The UK is in a very vulnerable place. It's not part of a big trading bloc anymore. But it does feel like almost... Listen, we won't forget the last few weeks, but it's almost basically back to where we were before.
But Tom, the numbers don't change, and I don't want to be, the pessimistic one, Dave. But if you look at the cards they've been dealt with, there's a bit of a honeymoon period where the markets say, right, we have grown-ups in charge, they're stabilizing the economy, there's experience, the cabinet's okay, and then there's a cost of living crisis, there's inflation going up, there's interest rates having to go up, which increases mortgages. So the numbers really haven't changed for the City of London. So I don't know how much the Prime Minister can give to finance really in this country.
Yeah, I don't think we should get too excited about sort of radical change or anything like that. I mean, you look at the personalities involved, they're all pretty stable. They obviously have had a very harsh lesson in the past few weeks about what happens if they do sort of overstretch, as it were. So I would agree. I think maybe the rhetoric might be a bit more positive, but I think if you're, comparing it to, say, what Kwarteng went with, you're not going to see anything like that. And, look, maybe this speaks to my own inherent laziness, but if I was Sunak, he's done a lot of this work as Chancellor, and I wouldn't be surprised if he just sort of kind of hauls that out again. And it's almost like, go back a year.
So what happens to this post-Brexit overhaul of regulation? Like, does it have to come from the Prime Minister? Does the Prime Minister say, look, I want to now focus on the City of London? Or is it the Chancellor? Or is it actually someone like John Glenn?
So it's a tricky, awkward little situation, that, because all of them have massively been involved in that in the last year or so. So we have Andrew Griffiths, who is the City Minister, and certainly the re-emergence of John Glenn into the Cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury sparked all sorts of speculation about what will happen there. But Glenn himself and Sunak, of course, when he was Chancellor, had a massive role in talking to all the city firms, trying to figure out what the future post-Brexit financial framework would be. So it could be quite an awkward three-way marriage there, where you've got the Prime Minister, who clearly has bigger things on his mind, but will definitely want to be part of this, Glenn, who has massively owned this, and Andrew Griffith, who has been running around the city talking to firms and who clearly has very ambitious ideas. So not clear now. And
is Andrew Griffith staying in that role? As I said, we don't know, right? I mean, that's a bit of an unknown at this point. He's definitely a bit more of a radical, it's part of the Truss pick than John Glenn. So is John Glenn's appointment as a chief secretary, does that mean we could expect a change there? We just don't know.
We just don't know, but certainly Andrew Griffith has been really quite radical and has certainly divided opinion among city people. Some people think they like his energy and his ambition, and we have reported for Bloomberg about the fact that they're really quite worried with Truss going, that that side of things might be put in a drawer. But then even before the sort of massive drama of the last couple of weeks, there were, among mainstream finance firms, really quite a lot of concerns with what Andrew Griffith, reflecting Truss and Kwarteng, wanted to do.
Too radical,
far too much, tacking away from the EU, too much rolling back of consumer and small business support. Basically Singapore on Thames.
So let's shelve this sweeping deregulation for the moment, but we're now talking about a windfall tax on banks.
Yeah, and I think that, to be honest, everything else is kind of on the sidelines. If say Sunak wants to go out there and really sort of get the banks on his side, he's going to not raise their taxes. And it's a very complicated situation because it's, been moving around and they've had reverse things or whatnot. But basically right now, corporation tax is going back up to 25%. Mm-hmm. And the big question is, what do the banks pay in this 8% surcharge? So back in the day when Sunak was Chancellor, he was saying, I will drop the surcharge to 3%. So you think banks will pay a 28% tax rate. And the big question now is, will that sort of decrease maybe be narrowed a bit? And that will be the big thing. And basically, you've heard on all the earnings calls, if the banks get away with 28% or maybe a little bit higher, great. It could go all the way to 33%. And that will be a very clear message as a negative to the City of London. And that will be bad news.
And I think with this tax thing now on them as corporations, there's a bit of a difference between the big UK banks, which I think essentially realise they're going to need to suck it up on a windfall tax, and some of the other big international banks, which maybe feel a bit more ambivalent about that. We reported that Jamie Dimon, the boss of JP Morgan, wanted to talk about tax with Jeremy Hunt, not in a sort of ticking him off way, of course, but in a sense of, well, can you give me an idea of what the actual plan is in the longer term, is our understanding. And I do wonder if Sunak, and it will be Sunak really, not Hunt, will sort of say, we're going to hit you now, but I'm going to send you a message that by 2024 or at some point in the future, our intention is to bring bank taxes down again because we do want UK banks to be internationally competitive.
Yeah, because that's the point, and as Tom said, we're in a competition in here in the city with Frankfurt, with Paris. JP Morgan have taken Amsterdam. JP Morgan have taken extra space, haven't they, in Paris? They're one of the banks that have really added to their staff in continental Europe. So, Sunak doesn't want to preside over more of a drip of jobs, does he, into continental Europe, particularly out of the city?
No, he really doesn't. As a Brexiteer himself, he wants to be able to prove that the UK has a very kind of strong and positive future as a financial centre. So, I mean, when he was Chancellor, the Treasury did a big piece of work looking at bank tax. And that's, as Tom said, that's how they came up with this level of 28%, which would be higher, crucially, than other companies. And they wanted to point that out. So banks needed to pay what was seen to be their fair dues, but was still internationally competitive. So that 28%
that
level,
was the sweet spot, right? That was supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly. That was the sweet spot as of last autumn. So it'll be very interesting to see what they say as of now.
What can we expect now that Sunak is in charge in terms of the divergence from Europe? After the chaos the last couple of weeks, it has been said, kind of for the first time with any credibility, actually, should we think again about forging a closer relationship back with the European Union. We had Guy Hands talking about how Britain is doomed unless they rethink that relationship. Is that coming into the equation at the moment? And where are we going to land in terms of that kind of distance with Brussels?
Yeah, I mean, there's very strong words from Guy Hands. I don't know, there's definitely that sentiment like kind of coursing through the city, but I think by and large people recognise, directionally there's no going to be immediate change for sure, and I think anything like that would be post a general election and probably many years hence in terms of certainly anything really substantive. And for Sunak, he was a Brexiteer, he wants to show that there are changes. I think there'll be a bit of it'll be a softer tone. Certainly won't be the Trussian sort of, bring up the drawbridges type situation. But I mean, this is the tough reality: is you can't move that far away from the EU because, frankly, a lot of these regulations are sort of internationally accepted. It's not like the EU is an outlier on many of these things. Don't want to get into insurance regulation, but for example, one of the big changes, Solvency II, touted as this huge, great big inflows coming into the UK economy of this. You've now got the backdrop of this, LDI crisis, which, I think has maybe put that on the back burner a bit.
But when you're going into the winter months with a huge cost of living crisis and inflation, how much should we actually care about the City of London? Controversial.
We could all just go home now.
Yeah, I'm horrified by that question.
It's all about jobs, Francine.
But it's like, should it really be the priority of the Prime Minister? Like, how much does the City of London contribute to overall GDP?
Oh, and I think it's a huge industry. It's 10% of the economy or around that. It's I think it's our biggest exporter. I mean, whichever way you look at the British economy, without the City of London, without finance, You've got to prioritise it on some level. And I think that was their big complaint during Brexit is, for political reasons, it got sidelined. And guess what? They're now paying the price for that because the City of London is kind of boxed in. I mean, it's still an enormous strength. I think no one's sort of thinking it won't be a global financial centre. But, you look at the opportunity costs that, perhaps could have been averted somewhat if there'd been a bit more of a dialogue with the city or, they'd been included on that trade deal. And I think to David's earlier question, I think that's the point is we're now starting to see what the cost is, and that will encourage, perhaps a bit more sort of centrist thinking on this and Singapore on Thames, which is a phrase I think people really hate, both because it's kind of offensive to Singapore and doesn't really capture the nuance here. But, that idea I feel is now sort of increasingly defunct and hopefully, like everything, it will probably be a bit of a grey area and there'll be a move to try and eke out some benefits without spooking either the Brexiteers or the Remainers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thanks for listening to This Week's in the City. We'll be back next week.
But in the meantime, if you like our show, please do head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and rate, review and subscribe. And Francine, do you think all those people who signed up for their free merch are enjoying the show?
I hope they are. Thank you so much for all of your great responses. I love also that a lot of you send screen grabs. I mean, we trust you to subscribe and listen to the podcast, but I do appreciate the screen grabs, and we will pick 5 of you, some great merch coming your way. Our producer, Summer, is nodding to that. She's ready.
Okay, so this episode was hosted by me, David Merritt.
And me, Francine Lacqua.
It was produced by Summer Sadi.
Special thanks to Simon Kennedy, Katherine Griffiths, and Tom Metcalf.